The way I explain it in class is I talk about the household economy as kind of the earlier version of things. So, you know, not everything was produced in the household, but most things were. And in fact, people within the household have divisions of labor that made them necessary and dependent on one another, right? That's not to say goods didn't come in from outside and there wasn't some monetary exchange, but most of the work that made a household work came from people who lived in there. And those households weren't necessarily just blood relations, right? They often included indentured servants and in the case of the plantation economy, slaves, right? So with industrialization, most of the work and the jobs that men did within that interdependent economy moved out into factory labor and became sort of work for a wage. What that meant in the household economy then is that men were working and getting basically compensation for just their work, like just their labor, not the larger product, but just their actual labor becomes the commodity to be exchanged. In the household, what that meant is that women's labor stayed the same, but it was unpaid. And so there is technological change that makes women's work lives in the household better, but it doesn't reduce the amount of work they have to do. So a great example of that is the washing machine. The electric washing machine reduces women's labor enormously. But what happens is the expectations and the standards for cleanliness, for clothing, for variety increase dramatically. And so where people used to wear the same 2 or 3 pieces of clothing all week and not wash them that frequently, suddenly you have this demand and desire for new clothes. Some of this is all compounded by the fact that the earliest factory laborers in the US were young women. Farm families, household economy would have many children because you have more children you have, the more laborers you have, but women don't inherit. And so if you have a lot of daughters, you know, you basically have more people who maybe be working, but may also be just more mouths to feed in the household. And so those were often the women who were sent off to the early textile mills. And the expectation was that they would be sending money home, or that they would then get married and not work in the mills. But the reality was that many of them stayed, and it was exploitative labor. And there's this different standard of expectation of wage for men and women in that setup. So number one, women were often put into jobs that looked like an extension of what they did in the home. So textiles, shoes, like that kind of small, what they would call, you know, women's nimble fingers labor. Anytime you introduce larger machines, men were brought back into the factories, which is interesting because the machine's supposed to make the labor easier, but it's more technical, and so therefore you need someone who can manage it. And what happens with wage labor that I think is really important to think about, and why we have it the way it is now in these kind of unequal forms, is that middle-class men, think about Mary Poppins, right? Mr. Banks works in a bank, and he makes a salary that allows him to have a wife who can be at home, who doesn't work. And that kind of middle-class Victorian ideal becomes something that working laborers in the factories aspire to, right? The idea of a breadwinner wage. It's not just 8 hours for what we will, right? But it's also a wage that supports a household and a family. But what that meant is that the male laborers were positioning themselves up and against women. And so women were paid less. And you see in the court records, you know, people say, you know, women suing for higher wages, and the court saying, well, women, we pay them this much because they eat less and they don't need as much, and they would spend it on cheap amusements, which are immoral and improper. And so the kind of ideologies that supported gender difference also then support differences in how people were compensated in wage. But when they're pushed in these court documents to talk about how do we establish what is the right amount for a wage, like what you pay, it was always fell back on custom, right? So in other words, whatever was the quote unquote custom of the time or the place, and not any kind of intrinsic valuation of the labor. That leads to this kind of unequal setup in terms of how wage work. It also meant that anytime groups of men laborers, you know, get too demanding in the marketplace, you can always bring in women and children as workers. And in particular, then once you divorce capital from location, you can do it on the global marketplace. So you can pick up your factory and move it to a country where women and children will work for much less.